My sister turned my grandfather's cabin into her personal party house. Then she told me I had no right to stop her. What made it worse was that the cabin wasn't some shared family vacation spot. It legally belonged to me. My grandfather had left it to me in his will, and somehow everyone was acting like I was the one causing problems. At first, I honestly thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding. I was wrong. My grandfather passed away about 8 months ago. Losing him was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through. We were incredibly close, especially during the last 10 years of his life. The cabin was our place. Every summer, every fishing trip, every repair project seemed to happen there. He taught me how to replace dock boards, fix leaking pipes, split firewood, and maintain the property. Some of my best memories were sitting on that porch at sunrise with a cup of coffee while he told stories about our family. Because of that, nobody in the family was shocked when the will was read. Grandpa left the lakeside cabin to me. He'd made his intentions clear long before he passed. In fact, he often joked that I already spent more time maintaining the place than he did. The property itself was valuable. The cabin sat on prime lakefront land and was worth roughly $400,000. But to me, the real value wasn't the money. It was the last place where I still felt connected to him. Grandpa was also very specific in his will. He wanted the cabin to stay with someone who would preserve it, care for it, and treat it as part of the family's history rather than just another asset. I was the only grandchild who consistently helped maintain it. My older sister Lauren couldn't have cared less about the place growing up. She always thought the cabin was outdated. While I loved spending weekends fishing and working on projects with Grandpa, Lauren preferred luxury resorts, beach hotels, and spa vacations. She complained constantly whenever she visited. Too many bugs. Too far from town. Bad cell service. No reliable Wi-Fi. Every visit came with a new complaint. By the time we became adults, she barely visited at all. I honestly couldn't remember the last time she'd spent more than a few hours there. Which is why what happened next completely blindsided me. A few weekends ago, I decided to drive up to the cabin. I hadn't spent much time there since inheriting it. I finally felt ready to sort through some of Grandpa's remaining belongings and spend a quiet weekend alone. The moment I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. There were 3 vehicles parked outside. Music was blasting from somewhere inside. People were laughing. For a second, I thought I had the wrong property. Then I walked up to the front door and realized the noise was coming from my cabin. I unlocked nothing because I never got the chance. Before I could even reach for my key, the front door swung open. A guy I'd never seen before stood there wearing swim shorts and holding a beer. He looked annoyed. "Yeah?" he asked. I stared at him. "Who are you?" He laughed. "No, who are you?" I pointed past him. "This is my cabin." The guy actually smirked. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "No, Lauren said her family owns it." Behind him I could see people everywhere. There were coolers on the floor. Wet towels draped over furniture. Several strangers were spread across Grandpa's living room like they owned the place. For a few seconds, I just stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Then I called Lauren. Immediately. She answered on the second ring. Before I could even finish explaining what I'd found, she sounded irritated. "Oh, that," she said casually. "That." As if finding strangers inside my inherited property was some minor inconvenience. Apparently, my parents had given her an old key months earlier. According to Lauren, she'd been using the cabin regularly for weekend trips with friends. Not only that, but she'd apparently started showing it off online as the family's vacation property. When I reminded her that Grandpa had left the cabin specifically to me, she became defensive almost instantly. "You're acting ridiculous," she said. Ridiculous. Grandpa would have wanted everyone to enjoy it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her that legally it belonged to me. Her response stunned me. "Just because your name is on some paperwork doesn't mean you get to keep it from the rest of us." Then she accused me of being selfish. Selfish? For not wanting strangers partying inside my grandfather's cabin. That should have been the end of it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. I called my parents hoping they'd clear things up. Instead, they sided with her. My mother said I was being territorial. My father suggested a compromise where Lauren could use the cabin every weekend because, according to him, I was busy working most weekdays anyway. Both of them kept repeating the same argument. Family should share. Grandpa would have wanted everyone together. The cabin shouldn't divide people. The more they talked, the more frustrated I became. Because they were ignoring one very important fact. Grandpa had already made his decision. He left the property to me. Not to all of us. Not to the family collectively. Me. And then I learned something that made the entire situation even worse. While I was talking to some of Lauren's friends, they casually mentioned how often they'd been staying there. The stories they shared made my blood boil. They'd been using Grandpa's fishing equipment and leaving it outside afterward. Dirty dishes sat in the sink for days. Empty beer bottles were left scattered across the deck. Someone had even carved their initials into a dining table that Grandpa had built by hand decades earlier. Then I discovered they had been building bonfires dangerously close to the tree line behind the cabin. At that moment, I stopped worrying about hurt feelings. I started worrying about whether there would even be a cabin left if this continued. Getting Lauren's friends out of the cabin turned into a nightmare. I thought once I explained that I owned the property, everyone would pack up and leave. That didn't happen. Several of them immediately got defensive. One guy actually stepped between me and the front door and argued that I had no right to kick them out. According to him, it was Lauren's cabin, not mine. Lauren's. I remember standing there wondering how many people she'd told that lie to. When I finally got everyone off the property, the entire situation felt humiliating. I was being treated like an intruder at the place my grandfather had trusted me to protect. And somehow I became the villain. Over the next few days, relatives started calling. Aunts, uncles, cousins I barely spoke to. Almost all of them had heard Lauren's version of the story first. According to her, I was on a power trip. I was trying to keep the family away from Grandpa's memory. I was turning the cabin into my private vacation home. The more people repeated it, the more frustrated I became. Because none of them seemed interested in one simple fact. The cabin wasn't family property. It wasn't jointly inherited. Grandpa had specifically left it to me. My parents kept pushing the same argument. You're focusing too much on the paperwork. Family should come before legal documents. Your grandfather wanted everyone together. At one point, my mother even asked whether preserving family relationships was really worth fighting over a cabin. I didn't know how to answer that. Because from my perspective, I wasn't the one creating the conflict. I wasn't demanding access to someone else's property. I wasn't bringing strangers into a family heirloom. I wasn't ignoring Grandpa's wishes. I was simply trying to protect what he'd entrusted to me. Still, the constant pressure got to me. For a while, I genuinely wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe I should just let Lauren use the place occasionally. Maybe everyone else was right. Then I would remember the carved table, the trash, the damaged equipment, the parties. And every time my doubts disappeared. Grandpa had spent decades preserving that property. I couldn't watch it get destroyed in less than a year. When I posted online asking for advice, I expected mixed reactions. Instead, thousands of strangers told me something I desperately needed to hear. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't selfish. And I definitely needed to take action. One question kept appearing repeatedly. How did Lauren even get a key? That answer came quickly. My mother admitted she still had an old spare key from years ago when she occasionally helped Grandpa clean the cabin. Without asking me, she handed it to Lauren shortly after the funeral. Just like that. No discussion. No permission. No consideration that the property now belonged to someone else. That conversation finally pushed me over the edge. The very next week, I changed every lock on the property. Cabin. Storage shed. Boathouse. Everything. I hired a locksmith and had the entire place rekeyed. Then I installed security cameras around the property and a basic monitoring system. For the first time since inheriting the cabin, I felt like I was actually protecting it. I didn't announce any of this to my family. I didn't ask for opinions. I simply handled it. I thought that would solve the problem. Unfortunately, that was only the beginning. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I started looking through Lauren's social media accounts. What I found made me physically sick. The timeline stretched back almost 4 months. Almost immediately after Grandpa's funeral. While I was grieving and handling estate paperwork, Lauren had apparently been treating the cabin like her personal resort. Post after post showed her and her friends lounging on the dock, swimming, drinking, hosting weekend gatherings. She'd even created a story highlight titled Lake Escape. In multiple posts, she referred to the property as our family cabin. The wording bothered me. Not because it technically used to belong to the family, but because she was deliberately presenting herself as someone with authority over it. Someone who could invite people whenever she wanted. Then I discovered something much worse. A former friend of Lauren's reached out privately after hearing about the situation. They sent me screenshots from a group chat. At first, I thought it was just more evidence of parties. I was wrong. Lauren wasn't simply inviting people. She was charging them. One message read, $200 for the weekend. Just leave it clean when you're done. Another person asked if they could reserve a date later in the summer. Lauren responded as though she were managing a rental property. Because apparently that's exactly what she'd been doing. I sat there staring at my phone in disbelief. While I was paying property taxes, insurance premiums, maintenance costs, and utility bills, my sister had been collecting money from people to use a property she didn't own. And she never gave me a dime. That should have been enough. But somehow there was more. After seeing those screenshots, I decided to call some of the neighboring property owners around the lake. Most of them had known Grandpa for years. The conversations were painful. Several neighbors thought I already knew what had been happening. One woman immediately said, "Thank goodness you're finally dealing with it." Another neighbor let out an audible sigh of relief when I introduced myself. Then they started telling me stories. Lots of stories. Late-night parties. Cars parked where they shouldn't be. Guests wandering onto neighboring properties. People blasting music well after midnight. One neighbor even mentioned a vehicle getting stuck in a marsh area because someone ignored clearly marked boundaries. Then I checked Grandpa's old landline. I'd kept it active because some of his longtime friends still occasionally called. I had never bothered checking the voicemail archive. That turned out to be a mistake. There were 17 messages waiting. 17. Most came from neighbors. Every single one was a complaint. Noise. Trespassing. Litter. Blocked access roads. Drunken guests. Listening to those recordings felt like being punched repeatedly in the stomach. For months this had been happening behind my back. And I had absolutely no idea. That's when I realized something important. Lauren hadn't just ignored my ownership. She hadn't just disrespected Grandpa's legacy. She'd been running an unauthorized vacation business from my inherited property while damaging relationships Grandpa had spent decades building with the community. And once I understood the full scale of what she'd been doing, I knew the situation was about to get much worse. As angry as I already was, I still hadn't seen the full extent of the damage. Every visit to the cabin seemed to reveal something new, something worse. The carved dining table had only been the beginning. While inspecting the property more carefully, I noticed burn marks along the deck railing. Someone had apparently been smoking outside and carelessly putting cigarettes out on the wood. A few days later, I discovered a cracked window in the boathouse. At first, I thought maybe it had been damaged by a storm. Then I got closer. The entire thing had been covered with duct tape. Not repaired. Not reported. Just patched up and ignored. The deeper I looked, the more furious I became. One afternoon, I opened a storage cabinet and found Grandpa's vintage tackle box. For most people, it would have looked like an old wooden fishing box. To me, it was one of his favorite possessions. He'd owned it for decades. He kept every lure carefully organized and polished. I still remembered him showing it to me when I was a kid. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Someone had used it as an ice chest. The wood was warped. Water damage had stained the interior. Rust covered several compartments. Years of care destroyed in a single weekend. I thought that would be the worst thing I'd find. Then I walked down to the dock. Someone had spray painted a stupid joke across the boards. Bright paint. Impossible to miss. I just stood there staring at it. That dock was where Grandpa taught me how to cast a fishing line. Where we'd watched sunsets together. Where we'd spent hundreds of quiet evenings talking. And now it looked like the wall of a college party house. At that point, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I called Lauren. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She exploded almost immediately. Instead of apologizing, she attacked me. According to her, I was obsessed with possessions. Obsessed with old furniture. Obsessed with preserving things that didn't matter. Then she said something I'll probably never forget. Grandpa would be ashamed of how materialistic you've become. I honestly couldn't believe she said that. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about property values. It was about respect. Respect for the man who built that place. Respect for the memories attached to it. Respect for the responsibility he trusted me with. Lauren didn't see it that way. She claimed the cabin had been sitting and used. That she was bringing life back to it. That people were finally enjoying it. I told her the parties needed to stop. The social media posts needed to stop. The unauthorized rentals needed to stop. Everything needed to stop. Her response was simple. She blocked me. Every platform. Every account. Then she immediately started telling family members that I was harassing her. Apparently, I was now the controlling brother who couldn't handle sharing. If I thought my parents might finally understand after seeing the evidence, I was wrong. Very wrong. I sat them down and showed them everything. The screenshots. The rental messages. The neighbor complaints. The property damage. The photos. I expected shock. Maybe disappointment. Maybe anger. Instead, they defended her again. My mother focused entirely on how I had obtained the screenshots. She accused me of invading Lauren's privacy. My father somehow managed to frame the rental scheme as a positive thing. He argued that Lauren charging her friends showed responsibility because she was helping cover expenses. I remember staring at him, genuinely speechless. Covering expenses? I was paying every expense. The taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the utilities. Lauren wasn't contributing a penny. She was profiting. And somehow I was still the problem. That should have been the lowest point. It wasn't. The real breaking point happened the following weekend. I drove to the cabin early Saturday morning. The moment I turned into the driveway, my heart sank. There was a vehicle parked outside. At first, I thought maybe someone was lost. Then I saw movement on the deck. Lauren. And two of her friends. Just sitting there. Relaxing. Like nothing had happened. Like the police hadn't already warned her. Like she hadn't been told repeatedly to stay away. I got out of the truck and walked toward them. Lauren was sitting in Grandpa's favorite chair. The exact chair he always used on summer evenings. The sight of it made my blood boil. When she saw me, she didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look nervous. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she crossed her arms and said, "We need to talk." The entitlement was unbelievable. I asked how she got inside. Apparently, she'd remembered an old window that didn't lock properly. A window she knew about from years ago. She'd climbed through it, then let her friends in. As if that were completely normal behavior. Lauren immediately launched into another speech. According to her, I was being dramatic. Changing the locks was childish. Cutting her off from the cabin was hurting the entire family. She accused me of destroying Grandpa's legacy. Of turning family members against each other. Of caring more about ownership than relationships. Meanwhile, she was literally trespassing. The irony seemed completely lost on her. I told her she needed to leave. Immediately. She laughed. Then she said the words that finally removed any remaining doubt I had. This is family property. I have every right to be here. Not, can we work something out? Not, let's compromise. Not even, I'm sorry. Just entitlement. Pure entitlement. When she refused to leave, I called the non-emergency police line. Making that call was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Nobody wants to involve law enforcement in a family dispute. Especially not with a sibling. But I had run out of options. The responding officer handled everything professionally. He listened to both sides. He reviewed the documentation. Then he explained something very clearly. Family disagreements didn't change ownership laws. The cabin belonged to me. And only I could decide who had permission to be there. Lauren was furious. But she left. Not voluntarily. And not happily. As she walked away, she spent the entire time furiously typing on her phone. I knew exactly what she was doing. Recruiting more relatives. Building support. Creating a new version of events where she was somehow the victim. Sure enough, the phone call started almost immediately. My aunt accused me of tearing the family apart. Several cousins sent long messages about forgiveness and family unity. One even suggested Grandpa would be ashamed of me. Those comments bothered me more than I expected. For a while, I started questioning myself again. Then something happened that changed everything. While sorting through more of Grandpa's documents, I discovered a folder addressed to his estate attorney. Inside was a personal letter. I almost didn't read it. I'm glad I did. The letter wasn't specifically addressed to me, but it explained his reasoning behind the will. And what I read left me speechless. Grandpa wrote that he'd seen families destroy themselves over inherited property. He'd watched siblings spend years fighting over homes, land, and vacation properties. He specifically mentioned that shared ownership often created resentment and conflict. Then came the sentence that hit me hardest. He wrote that the cabin should belong to someone who would preserve its peaceful character and protect it from becoming a party destination. I read that line 3 times. Maybe 4. Because suddenly everything made sense. Grandpa hadn't made a random decision. He hadn't chosen me by accident. He saw exactly what could happen. He understood the personalities involved. And long before any of this started, he had already made his choice. The problem was that nobody else seemed willing to accept it. And I had a feeling the fight over the cabin was far from over. After finding Grandpa's letter, my doubts started to fade. For the first time since all of this began, I felt completely certain that I was doing what he wanted. That didn't make the situation easier. If anything, it made it sadder. Because every step I took to protect the cabin seemed to push me further away from my family. Still, I knew I couldn't afford to be passive anymore. The property had already suffered enough damage. I upgraded the security system. Added additional cameras. Installed motion alerts. I even spoke with a property management company about performing periodic inspections whenever I couldn't be there myself. At the recommendation of my attorney, I also started documenting everything. Every phone call. Every text. Every incident. Every attempted entry. My lawyer wasn't concerned about ownership. The paperwork was clear. The will was clear. Lauren had no legitimate claim to the property. But he warned me that people don't always need a strong legal case to create expensive problems. That advice turned out to be incredibly important. One positive thing did happen during that period. After hearing about the complaints, I personally contacted several neighbors around the lake. I wanted to apologize. Not because I had caused the disturbances, but because I felt responsible for fixing them. Most were surprisingly kind. A few even seemed relieved that someone was finally addressing the situation. One older couple invited me over for coffee while I was visiting the area. They spent nearly an hour telling stories about Grandpa. Apparently, he'd helped repair their dock after a storm years ago and refused to accept any payment. Another neighbor described how Grandpa would check on vacant properties during the winter and notify owners if something looked wrong. The more people talked about him, the clearer one thing became. He was deeply respected. Not because he owned a beautiful cabin. Because he treated people well. Which somehow made Lauren's behavior feel even worse. I thought maybe things would settle down after a few months. I was wrong. 3 months passed. Then 4. And my family somehow became even more determined to force the issue. The security cameras alone justified every dollar I'd spent. Without them, I honestly don't know what would have happened. The first incident occurred late one Saturday afternoon. An alert popped up on my phone showing movement near the cabin. I opened the camera feed. There was Lauren. Standing beside a ladder. At first, I thought maybe she was doing something harmless. Then she carried the ladder toward the side of the cabin and positioned it beneath an upstairs window. She was trying to get inside. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't some misunderstanding anymore. She knew she wasn't allowed there. She simply didn't care. A couple weeks later, another alert appeared. This time Lauren had brought a man I'd never seen before. The two of them spent nearly 20 minutes walking around the property, studying doors, examining windows, checking access points. They never entered, but the entire thing felt unsettling. It looked less like a visit and more like reconnaissance. Then came the third incident. The one that genuinely scared me. I received another motion notification while I was at work. When I opened the feed, Lauren was standing near the front entrance holding a crowbar. A crowbar. At first, I thought I had to be misunderstanding what I was seeing. Then she wedged it into the door frame and started pulling. Thankfully, she gave up after a few minutes. But seeing my own sister attempt to force entry into my property changed something inside me. Whatever this conflict had originally been, it had become something much uglier. That should have been the most shocking thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The fourth incident was somehow worse. I was sitting at my desk when another alert appeared. I opened the camera feed and immediately froze. Lauren was there again. But she wasn't alone. My parents were with her. And standing beside them was a locksmith. For several seconds I simply stared at the screen. Surely this couldn't be happening. But it was. I watched as they spoke with the locksmith near the front door. The locksmith seemed hesitant. Even through the camera I could tell he was asking questions. Eventually he requested proof of ownership. That was when everything became even more surreal. My father started insisting that the property belonged to the family. My mother began crying. Actually crying. She told the locksmith that her cruel son had locked everyone out of their family memories. I wish I were exaggerating. I immediately called the company. Thankfully, I reached someone quickly. I explained that I was the legal owner and that the people requesting service had no authority over the property. Within minutes, the locksmith packed up and left. Before driving away, he spent several moments arguing with my father. Even through the security footage, I could see Dad gesturing angrily. Watching the entire scene felt like some bizarre alternate reality. My own parents had just attempted to gain access to my property without permission. Not because they needed anything. Not because there was an emergency. Simply because they believed the rules shouldn't apply to them. The emotional pressure never stopped. Every family gathering became about the cabin. Every holiday. Every birthday. Every barbecue. Every wedding. It didn't matter. Someone would eventually corner me and start another conversation. Usually the same conversation. Why couldn't I compromise? Why was I being stubborn? Why was I putting property ahead of family? At my cousin's wedding, I barely made it through dinner before relatives started approaching me. One aunt trapped me near the reception hall in trance and lectured me for almost half an hour. According to her, I was destroying the family's future. She insisted Grandpa would be devastated if he could see what was happening. I wanted to ask why nobody seemed concerned about what Lauren had actually done. The damage, the rentals, the break-ins, the lies. But I already knew the answer. Because none of those facts fit the story they preferred. Then came the conversation that hurt more than anything else. My grandmother called me. Grandpa's widow. 84 years old. Still grieving. Still struggling after losing the person she'd spent most of her life with. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was crying. Real heartbreaking tears. Between sobs, she told me that Lauren had explained the situation. Or rather, Lauren's version of it. According to Grandma, I was preventing the family from gathering at the lake. Keeping everyone away from memories of Grandpa. Refusing to let people heal. The entire conversation felt like a punch to the chest. I tried explaining everything. The parties. The damage. The unauthorized rentals. The attempted break-ins. The police involvement. All of it. But grief is complicated. And Lauren had reached her first. Grandma kept repeating the same thing. Family needs to stay together. Your grandfather wouldn't want division. Please be the bigger person. By the time the call ended, I was emotionally exhausted. Not because I thought she was right. But because I realized Lauren was now using our grandmother's grief as a weapon. And if she was willing to do that, I had no idea what she might try next. If I had hoped the situation would eventually burn itself out, I was completely wrong. Lauren simply changed tactics. When she couldn't get access to the cabin physically, she started fighting online. At first it was subtle. Old family photos. Pictures from birthdays. Holiday cookouts. Fishing trips from years ago. Most were taken long before Grandpa passed away. The captions were what caught my attention. Missed the days when family mattered more than ownership. Some people forget where they came from. Sad when memories become private property. She never mentioned me directly. She didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The comments were even worse. Friends, relatives, people who knew only her version of events. All repeating the same narrative. I had supposedly stolen the family's gathering place. I had locked everyone out. I had chosen a building over relationships. The truth didn't seem to matter anymore. Lauren had created a story people wanted to believe. And unfortunately, that story painted her as the victim. Then things started affecting my actual life. People I didn't know began leaving comments on my professional social media accounts. A few accused me of being selfish. Others called me greedy. One person somehow found my employer and left a negative public review, claiming I lacked integrity and couldn't be trusted. That was the moment I realized the situation had gone far beyond a family disagreement. I had to notify my HR department. Explaining that conversation was one of the most embarrassing moments of my career. Thankfully, they were understanding. But it was still humiliating. Lauren's actions were now affecting my reputation outside the family. And she either didn't care or actively wanted that outcome. Then came the incident that genuinely disturbed me. About 6 weeks ago, I arrived at the cabin for a long weekend. Everything looked normal from the outside. The doors were locked. The windows appeared secure. Nothing seemed out of place. At first. But the second I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. There were dishes in the sink. Fresh ones. Not mine. Towels had been left on the bathroom floor. Furniture had been moved slightly. Small things. The kind of details only someone familiar with the property would notice. My heart started racing. Someone had been inside. I searched every room carefully. Nothing appeared stolen. No obvious vandalism. Then I reached Grandpa's bedroom. Several drawers had been opened. His closet had clearly been searched. Storage boxes had been moved around. Whoever entered had gone through his personal belongings. That upset me more than I can properly explain. It felt invasive. Disrespectful. Almost like someone had disturbed a grave. I spent the next hour checking every room. Then I found something that sent a chill down my spine. A note. Left in the guest bedroom. Someone had apparently slept there. The note sat on the bedside table. Just a few sentences. This place has too much love to be locked away. Jay would want everyone to feel welcome here. Jay was Grandpa. Very few people outside the family called him that. I immediately suspected Lauren. The handwriting looked familiar. Not enough to prove anything. But enough to make my stomach sink. When I confronted her, she denied everything. Of course she did. According to Lauren, I was imagining things. Someone else must have left it. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a friend. Maybe anyone but her. The denial wasn't even convincing. By that point, I was simply exhausted. I upgraded security again. Stronger locks, reinforced doors, additional cameras, window sensors. Every improvement felt ridiculous. I wasn't protecting a bank vault. I was protecting a family cabin. But my own family kept giving me reasons to take those precautions. Ironically, the cabin became my refuge during all of this. I started spending more weekends there. Partly because I wanted to monitor the property. Partly because it was the one place where I still felt close to Grandpa. The family drama seemed quieter when I sat on the dock at sunrise. The pressure disappeared for a little while. And I found myself understanding Grandpa more than ever. Around that time, I finally started seeing a therapist. Honestly, I should have done it sooner. The constant conflict was draining me emotionally. The grief, the guilt, the accusations, the family pressure. It all piled up. What surprised me most was hearing an objective outsider's perspective. My therapist listened to everything. The will, the damage, the trespassing, the manipulation. Then she said something that stuck with me. Everyone keeps asking you to sacrifice your grandfather's wishes for family harmony. Has anyone asked your sister to sacrifice her demands for family harmony? That question hit hard. Because the answer was obvious. No. Every compromise required something from me. Nothing from Lauren. She wanted access, control, permission, validation. And everyone else expected me to provide it. Meanwhile, she never apologized. Never accepted responsibility. Never acknowledged any damage she'd caused. The more time I spent sorting through Grandpa's belongings, the stronger my resolve became. I found journals he'd kept for years. Entries about wildlife around the lake. Notes about repairs. Weather observations. Fishing reports. Stories about neighbors. Plans for future improvements. Every page reflected how much he loved that property. One journal entry described a particularly peaceful morning on the deck. Another talked about replacing dock boards with his own hands. And then there was one sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. He wrote that he hoped the next generation would understand what made the cabin special. Not the land. Not the value. The feeling. The peace. The responsibility. A few weeks later, I found more correspondence between Grandpa and his attorney. One exchange addressed the exact question everyone kept throwing at me. Should the cabin be shared among multiple heirs? The lawyer had apparently raised the possibility. Grandpa's response was direct. The cabin needs one caretaker who understands its value. Too many owners ruin a property. I must have reread that line 20 times. Because it answered every accusation my family kept making. Grandpa had considered shared ownership. He had rejected it. Deliberately. Thoughtfully. For specific reasons. Those letters gave me something I desperately needed. Certainty. I wasn't betraying his wishes. I was following them. That certainty helped me through what happened next. Because 2 weeks ago, Lauren made what she called a final attempt to solve the situation. One evening there was a knock on my apartment door. I opened it and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Lauren was standing there. So were my parents. The three of them looked unusually serious. Almost rehearsed. Lauren folded her arms. My father carried a folder. My mother looked like she had already been crying. The moment I saw them, I knew this wasn't a social visit. They had come with a plan. And judging by their expressions, they expected me to agree. I had no idea just how far they were about to take things. The meeting at my apartment turned out to be exactly what I feared. It wasn't a conversation. It was an ultimatum. My parents and Lauren sat at my kitchen table acting like they had come to save the family from a crisis. In reality, they were asking me to surrender the one thing Grandpa had specifically trusted me to protect. My father opened the folder he'd brought. Inside was what they called a solution. Lauren immediately started explaining. The proposal was simple. The cabin would be placed into a family trust. Everyone would receive equal access. Everyone would have voting rights. Major decisions would require group approval. According to them, this would restore peace and reunite the family. I listened quietly. Then I asked one question. What happens when someone wants to rent it out again? Nobody answered. What happens when someone damages the property? Still silence. What happens when 10 different people disagree about maintenance? Lauren rolled her eyes. My father sighed dramatically. My mother started crying. The discussion quickly stopped being about practical solutions. It became emotional pressure. Lauren accused me of choosing a building over my family. My mother said Grandpa would be devastated by the division. My father told me this was my last opportunity to do the right thing. Then came the statement that changed everything. If you don't cooperate, my father said, we may have to consider legal action. The room went silent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For nearly a year I'd tolerated insults, manipulation, harassment, trespassing, public humiliation. But now they were threatening a lawsuit because I refused to give away property that legally belonged to me. Something inside me finally snapped. Not angrily, not dramatically, just completely. I was done. I calmly explained that the cabin belonged to me, legally, undisputedly. If they chose to pursue legal action, I would respond accordingly. And that response would include claims related to trespassing, attempted unlawful entry, property damage, harassment, and interference with my property rights. For the first time during the entire conversation, nobody had a comeback. Lauren looked stunned. My mother stopped crying. My father simply stared at me. A few minutes later they left. Angry, disappointed, certain that I was the villain. The front door closed behind them. And strangely I felt relief. Not happiness. Relief. Because after months of pressure, accusations, and guilt, the fight was finally out in the open. There were no more compromises to discuss. No more negotiations. No more pretending this was about family memories. It had always been about control. And I had finally refused to surrender it. We haven't spoken since that day. The silence has been complicated. Part of me misses them. I miss the family I thought I had. The holidays. The casual phone calls. The feeling that we were all on the same side. But when I think about everything that happened, I realize those relationships were already damaged long before the silence began. The difference is that now nobody is pretending otherwise. Over the following months, I spent more time at the cabin than ever before. I started working remotely from there whenever possible. Some mornings I'd sit on the deck with coffee and watch the lake wake up. Other days I'd spend hours repairing small things Grandpa had planned to fix himself. For the first time, the property felt truly mine. Not because I owned it. Because I understood the responsibility attached to it. Several people suggested something I hadn't considered before. Updating my own estate plans. At first, the idea felt strange. I wasn't old. I wasn't expecting anything to happen to me. But after everything with my family, I understood why Grandpa had been so careful. He'd seen problems coming long before anyone else did. I've started speaking with an attorney about making sure the cabin eventually passes to someone who will genuinely care for it. Someone who understands that ownership isn't just about access. It's about stewardship. 6 months have passed since my last update. Looking back, I can honestly say I've found peace. Not resolution. Not reconciliation. The security improvements worked. After receiving a formal cease and desist letter from my attorney, Lauren stopped showing up at the property. The letter documented every incident. Every attempted break-in. Every act of trespassing. Every known instance of unauthorized use. It also made one thing crystal clear. Any future violations would result in legal consequences. Apparently, that message finally got through. The relationship with my parents and Lauren never recovered. For the last 4 months, there has been almost no contact. The only exception was one final phone call from my mother. Predictably, it involved more guilt. She tearfully explained that Lauren was considering moving out of state because she felt rejected by the family. A year earlier that call would have devastated me. This time I mostly felt tired. The pattern was too familiar. Every problem somehow became my responsibility. Every consequence of Lauren's actions somehow became my fault. For once, I refused to carry that burden. The extended family pressure has mostly faded. Partly because people got bored. Partly because they realized I wasn't changing my mind. I'm no longer invited to many family gatherings. At first, that hurt. Now, I view it differently. Distance has brought clarity. One cousin quietly admitted that Lauren still tells people I've become obsessed with money. Another said she regularly describes me as paranoid and controlling. I stopped defending myself. People who want to believe those stories will believe them regardless of what I say. The most painful loss was my grandmother. She passed away 3 months ago. And if I'm being honest, I still struggle with that. By the end, Lauren had completely convinced her that I was keeping the family away from Grandpa's memory. Grandma genuinely believed she was trying to fix something broken. I don't blame her. Grief makes people vulnerable. And Lauren knew exactly how to use that vulnerability. I attended the funeral. But I wasn't included in the planning. I wasn't consulted about anything. I simply showed up, paid my respects, and sat quietly. Then, during the service, Lauren mentioned the cabin again. Even then, she spoke about family gatherings at the lake. About memories being lost. About people being separated. I remember sitting in the pew wondering if the conflict would ever stop following us. Thankfully, something inside me had changed. Because instead of feeling guilty, I felt certain. Certain that I had done what Grandpa asked me to do. And for the first time, that certainty mattered more than everyone else's opinion. The cabin has become something different now. Not a battlefield. Not a symbol of conflict. A place of healing. I've spent countless hours reading Grandpa's journals. Studying his notes. Learning things about him I never knew while he was alive. He documented everything. The changing seasons. Wildlife migrations. Fishing conditions. Repairs. Weather patterns. Even small moments that most people would have forgotten. The more I read, the more I realized the cabin had never been about ownership. It was about preservation. About protecting something meaningful long enough to pass it forward. And for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt like I was finally succeeding. The more time I spent reading Grandpa's journals, the more I understood something important. The cabin was never just a building to him. It was part of his identity. Every repair. Every improvement. Every quiet morning by the lake. He treated the property almost like a living thing that needed care and attention. One journal entry in particular stayed with me. It had been written about 5 years before he passed away. Most of the entry described routine maintenance. Replacing damaged dock boards. Checking storm damage. Cleaning debris after a rough winter. Nothing dramatic. Then he mentioned Lauren. Apparently she had visited that weekend. His description was painfully familiar. He wrote that she spent most of her time complaining. The mosquitoes were annoying. The internet was too slow. The cabin was too quiet. She kept asking why he didn't modernize everything. Then came a sentence that hit me harder than I expected. Grandpa wrote, "Not everyone finds peace in simple places, and that's okay. But I sometimes wonder what happens to places like this when people stop seeing their value." I sat there staring at those words for a long time. Because they perfectly captured the entire conflict. The argument had never been about ownership. It was about appreciation. Grandpa and Lauren simply valued the cabin in completely different ways. And Grandpa knew it. That realization became even clearer when I found another notebook. This one surprised me. Grandpa had apparently kept records of family visits over the years. Not in a judgmental way. More like personal observations. Who visited. How long they stayed. What activities they enjoyed. What projects they helped with. At first, I laughed because it seemed like such a grandpa thing to do. Then I started adding things up. The difference was staggering. Over roughly 10 years, I had spent hundreds of days at the cabin. Fishing trips. Maintenance weekends. Holiday visits. Storm cleanup. Dock repairs. Painting. Landscaping. General upkeep. I was there constantly. Lauren, meanwhile, appeared only occasionally. Most of those visits happened during larger family gatherings. And according to Grandpa's notes, she usually spent most of her time indoors scrolling through her phone or asking when everyone was leaving. Reading those records removed the last bit of guilt I had been carrying. For months, family members had acted as though Grandpa's decision had been unfair, arbitrary, cruel. But it wasn't. He had observed our behavior for years. He knew who invested time and effort into the property. He knew who cared about preserving it. And he made his decision accordingly. The more evidence I found, the more I understood that the inheritance wasn't a reward. It was a responsibility. That perspective changed how I approached the cabin. Instead of simply maintaining it, I started actively restoring it. One of my first major projects was rebuilding sections of the dock. Thankfully, Grandpa had documented almost everything. Measurements, materials, maintenance schedules. Even notes about which wood treatments held up best against the lake conditions. Following those instructions felt strangely comforting. like receiving guidance from him one last time. I also restored the native flower garden near the shoreline. The garden had suffered badly during the months Lauren and her friends used the property. Several sections were trampled. Others had died from neglect. Grandpa had spent decades cultivating those plants. Bringing them back felt important. Another project became unexpectedly emotional. The workshop. The small workspace attached to the boathouse. When Lauren's friends had taken over the cabin, they turned it into a storage area for coolers, folding chairs, and party supplies. The place had become cluttered and disorganized. While cleaning it out, I discovered one of Grandpa's old sketches. It showed exactly how he arranged every tool, every shelf, every drawer, every workbench. It was essentially a map of the workshop. So I rebuilt it exactly as he designed it. That project took weeks. And honestly, it became one of my favorite memories from the entire year. Every hammer, every wrench, every container. Putting everything back where it belonged felt like continuing conversations we'd started years ago. Conversations interrupted by his death. The lake community also became an unexpected source of comfort. The same neighbors who had once called to complain about Lauren's parties slowly became friends. Many of them shared stories I had never heard before. One couple told me Grandpa helped install their dock after a severe storm. He refused payment. Another family described how he regularly shared vegetables from his garden. One neighbor recalled how Grandpa would quietly clear fallen branches from vacant properties after storms without ever mentioning it. The stories kept coming. And every story revealed the same thing. People respected him. Not because he owned valuable property. Because he was generous, reliable, kind. Those conversations helped me realize something I'd overlooked. By caring for the cabin, I wasn't simply preserving a building. I was preserving part of Grandpa's legacy. The relationships, the traditions, the reputation he spent decades building. Even the financial side eventually became easier to manage. Property values around the lake continued rising. Fortunately, my job allowed me to comfortably handle maintenance costs, insurance, taxes, and improvements. I also became obsessive about documentation. Not because of legal concerns anymore. Because I wanted a record. A history. The same way Grandpa had documented everything. Every repair. Every improvement. Every project. Every expense. If someone eventually inherited the cabin after me, I wanted them to understand its story. And that thought led me to another important decision. I worked with my attorney to establish clear plans for the future. No ambiguity. No assumptions. No opportunities for future family disputes. The cabin would remain under my ownership. Future inheritance decisions would be based on demonstrated respect for the property and the values Grandpa cared about. Not entitlement. Not family pressure. Not emotional manipulation. Most importantly, I finally stopped feeling guilty. That took longer than anything else. For nearly a year, guilt had followed me everywhere. Every angry phone call. Every accusation. Every family gathering. Every social media post. A part of me kept wondering whether preserving the cabin was worth losing relationships. Therapy helped me answer that question. My therapist pointed out something simple but powerful. Healthy boundaries often upset people who benefit from having none. The more I thought about that, the more sense it made. Nobody was angry because I had done something wrong. They were angry because I had stopped giving them what they wanted. And those are two very different things. For the first time since Grandpa died, I truly trusted my own judgment. Grandpa had trusted me with something deeply important to him. Honoring that trust sometimes required difficult choices. Sometimes it required disappointing people. Sometimes it required standing alone. But preserving what he valued meant protecting it even when protection wasn't popular. And looking out over the lake one evening, I realized I finally understood why he had chosen me. Over the past year, the cabin has become something I never expected. Not a source of conflict. Not a symbol of inheritance. Not even a reminder of everything my family and I lost. It became proof that Grandpa had been right. These days, I've started keeping records the same way he did. At first, it happened almost accidentally. After finishing a dock repair one afternoon, I wrote down what I'd done. A week later, I noted the return of a family of loons that nested near the far side of the lake. Then I started documenting everything. Weather patterns, maintenance projects, wildlife sightings, seasonal changes, small memories, quiet moments. The same kinds of observations Grandpa filled his journals with for decades. Maybe nobody will ever read those notes. Maybe someday they will. Either way, writing them feels important. Like I'm continuing a tradition that meant something to him. A tradition built on care rather than ownership. The strange thing is that once the constant family drama disappeared, I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to preserve all those years. The cabin wasn't valuable because of the land, or the market price, or even the family history attached to it. It was valuable because of what happened there. The silence, the peace, the ability to slow down, to sit still, to appreciate simple things. For most of my life, I thought Grandpa loved the cabin because he enjoyed fishing. Now I realize fishing was only part of it. What he really loved was being present. watching the lake change throughout the seasons, listening to the wind through the trees, fixing things with his own hands, feeling connected to something larger than himself. I understand that now. Last month, I experienced a moment I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. I was sitting on the deck before sunrise. The lake was perfectly still. No boats, no music, no arguments, no family drama. Just quiet. I was sitting in Grandpa's old chair, drinking coffee from one of the mugs he'd used for years. As the sun started rising over the water, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. The break-ins, the accusations, the police visits, the pressure, the threats, the months of guilt. And then a realization hit me. For the first time since Grandpa died, I wasn't angry. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't trying to convince anyone I was right. I was simply enjoying the cabin, the way he had intended. In that moment, I finally understood what he'd been trying to leave behind. Not property, not money, not even a building. A way of appreciating life. A place where someone could step away from the noise of the world and remember what actually matters. That's when I realized I'd accomplished exactly what he had hoped for. The cabin was still standing. It was being cared for. The traditions were continuing. And despite everything that happened, the place remained what it had always been. A sanctuary. Will my family ever understand that? Probably not. Lauren still believes I stole something from her. My parents still think I should have compromised. Some relatives likely still tell the story as if I'm the selfish brother who chose a cabin over family. I've accepted that. Because I've also learned something important. Not every relationship survives boundaries. Sometimes people only like you when you're willing to give them what they want. When you stop doing that, they reveal who they really are. That realization hurt. But it also brought clarity. The cabin cost me relationships. I won't pretend otherwise. There are days when I miss the family I used to have. There are moments when I wonder whether things could have turned out differently if everyone had acted with a little more respect and honesty. Sometimes I even question whether I should have tried harder to keep the peace. But those thoughts never last long. Because every time I walk through the cabin, I see evidence of why Grandpa trusted me. The restored workshop, the repaired dock, the thriving garden, the journals, the traditions, the care. Everything he spent decades building is still there. And that's because someone protected it when it mattered most. Before ending this story, I want to thank everyone who supported me throughout this experience. When the pressure from my family felt overwhelming, hearing objective opinions helped me stay grounded. It reminded me that honoring someone's final wishes isn't selfish. Protecting something meaningful isn't selfish. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. If anyone reading this is facing a similar inheritance dispute, my advice is simple. Remember who entrusted you with that responsibility in the first place. People will always have opinions. They'll tell you to compromise, to keep the peace, to avoid conflict. But sometimes preserving what matters requires standing alone. And that's okay. The cabin will always be Grandpa's legacy. I'm simply the person he trusted to protect it. I hope I've made him proud. And while part of me still wishes my family had chosen a different path, I no longer regret the choice I made. AITA for refusing to share the cabin my grandfather left to me and forcing my sister out after she turned it into her personal party house.